Hello, and welcome to my T-Rex talk. Before we begin, I'm going to do a slight introduction for myself. My name is Bipolar Birdie. That's not my given name, it's just the name I use on the internet to remain anonymous. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm not actually bald in real life. Getting hair on this stall would just been a pain. I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder 1 during the last year of my grad school at age 23. Now for some other basic stuff. I got my bachelor's and master's from the University of Texas, Austin, in computer science a couple of years ago, and currently I'm working as a tutor for some students who have fallen behind during the pandemic, since school has gone between person and online and back and forth a couple of times. I'm hoping to work at the university level as an educator sometime in the near future. I've applied to a couple of universities and we're going to see how it goes from there. Today we're going to talk about lateral rationality. This is a type of logic that someone who is having a manic episode might use. The idea is that the people who are manic are not actually irrational. Irrational here meaning not logical or reasonable. It's not that they stop using logic or being able to use it. It's that our logic becomes a little magical and fantastical along the way. Before we start about that, we need to talk about what logic actually is. Because I have a computer science degree, logic to me means predicate logic. The idea here is that you take a series of assumptions, and those assumptions relate to each other, and then you use the relationships between your assumptions to come to a conclusion. The most basic predicate logic relationship is that A implies B, and then we can use that implication and implications like it later to make more complex conclusions as we go along. The most common fallacy that people who are having a manic episode create is whenever they try to extend the logic past its natural limits. Typical predicate logic goes like this. A implies B, B implies C, so A implies C, because B is in the middle there, and we can remove it safely and to make A imply B. And it gets even more intense when instead of an implication, it's an equivalency. So we can say A equals B, B equals C, so A equals C. That logic is what happens in someone who's having a manic episode's brain. They are trying to draw conclusions about the world around them. Their assumptions are just a little bit off. It's sort of like near rhyme. You hear it out loud, and you can say, okay, that's almost right, but it's just enough off that you're wrong. The best example I have of this is the little boy from As They Lay Dying. In this book, the mother of the family dies, and they transport her body across a distance. It's actually a really sad book. Anyway, in the book, the narrator changes every chapter. There's a chapter from the little boy's point of view that starts, "My mother's a fish." This makes no sense, or it doesn't seem to make sense to anyone outside the little boy's brain. But actually what happened was the little boy went, okay, my mom is dead, that fish is dead, so my mom's a fish. It makes a weird sort of sense once it's explained. When you say it out loud for the first time, it just sounds like nonsense. This is what you have to remember when you're talking to somebody who's having a manic episode. They're that little boy, doing gymnastics with their logic that sounds like it should make sense, but we know, as people at our baselines, that it doesn't quite match reality. That leads to the next part, when assumptions just aren't based in reality at all. Let's say you're talking to somebody who's episodic, and they say something to you like, we can get to Atlantis in 2 seconds. They've made two assumptions that aren't based in reality. First, that Atlantis exists. As far as we know, it doesn't. And they've also assumed that wormholes exist. Obviously, you can get to Atlantis in 2 seconds if those two things are true. It's difficult because when they tell you that, you want to write them off, right? You want to say this person is being crazy and irrational. But if you were to ask them to explain what they just said, they could tell you exactly the steps they took to get to their conclusion. They'd say, well, we could use a wormhole to get to Atlantis. You would know that those things aren't based in reality, but for them they are real. So what they said did make sense, for them at least. What if they say something that is just totally off the wall that you know is heavily drenched in metaphor? I said something like that. When I was having my second episode, I kept telling the doctors that the fish were drowning. What I meant was that the patients weren't getting the help they needed to get better, and the fish were drowning instead. What was supposed to be helping them was hurting them. Therefore, the water was hurting fish, and the fish were drowning. Interestingly, my mom was there, and she said when I said it, and she was able to translate it perfectly for the doctor because she knew I was saying things that made sense to me, even if they didn't make sense to everyone around me. She understood that my IQ didn't drop. I didn't stop being a logical person. It just became a little bit twisted. In the same vein, when someone who's episodic is repeating a single word over and over again, it's like word association backwards with super long leaps. Not only is the person thinking really fast, their thought process out loud has jumps. My mom calls it failing to signal, like with the car. They forget to tell you they're going to switch topics, and they forget to tell you what the topic was to begin with. When I was in the hospital the most recent time, there was a patient who kept calling the text Hitler. She said it to someone after they told her she wasn't allowed to have any food. She kept calling them Hitler, and for some reason the text didn't understand that those things were related. I looked at a nurse and I was like, hey, I can explain to you why she's yelling that really offensive name at you. And they're like, oh, okay, explain it to me. The association backwards was Hitler, concentration camps, jail, denying food. She went from denying food to Hitler in like 0 to 100, and they weren't able to follow it at all. Sometimes following the association backwards is just too much for someone who's not living in their brain, because the jumps are too much and sometimes they're sideways. The point is what they're saying would eventually have some sort of pattern or logic to it. You just have to follow it, especially if they're not so far gone that any communication has become impossible. Basically, the conclusion is that the person who is manic is still as smart as they are at their baseline, and they're still using logic. It's just a magically twisted version. Instead of treating people like they're stupid or like what they're doing is completely crazy and off the wall, I think we should treat them like very, very smart / precocious 5-year-olds. They are still highly intelligent, and they're using magical thinking, and not everything they say makes sense to us because their thought process has shifted to the left a little bit, and they're no longer starting from the same point that we are. They also have lost some EQ, emotional quotient, making their emotions come to the surface and making interaction with them slightly awkward. So that's it. This is why I get very upset whenever I'm called irrational when I'm having a manic episode, because I know I'm not being irrational, I'm just not myself. I'm super myself, being laterally rational. Thank you for coming to my T-Rex talk. Be sure to check out my Twitter and Instagram at Bipolar Record. Stay tuned for the next T-Rex talk that I'm going to have. I'm not sure what the topic will be, but it should be interesting. Until next time.